Institute on Ecosystems Rough Cut Seminar Series. We do not have a rough cut next week, but the following week, the founder of Mountain Journal, Todd Wilkinson, will be presenting on whether we can save the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So please tune in for that on October 26th. As a reminder to our folks online, today's seminar is being recorded, and we ask that you keep your microphones and cameras off during the presentation. And we invite you to put your questions in the chat, but please hold questions for the end, and I'll help facilitate the Q&A at the end. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Andy to introduce our speaker.
Kathryn, welcome.
Thank you, Andy. A pleasure to be here.
Last week, Arthur Middleton nicely highlighted the importance of private lands, the ecology of GYE, and the high rate of loss of those lands. And of course, conservation easements are a main vehicle for trying to protect some of those private lands. And so in that regard, it's just wonderful that Kathryn is joining us. She's the resource manager for Greater Yellowstone for the Montana Land Reliance. Kathryn grew up here in the valley. Our family has a ranch along the Gallatin River and have donated easements for the property. So she has that type of firsthand experience. Kathryn studied biology at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks, and then worked in real estate related activities in the Bay Area of California before coming back to Montana. And now she's in the quick of it with Montana Land Reliance in terms of working with landowners to develop easements and involved with education and fundraising. And she's going to talk today about forever benefit, conservation easements and GYE.
Thank you, Andy. Well, it is a pleasure to be here today, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to dedicated to outreach, education, collaboration amongst land trusts, policy activities, and so on. And these 12 land trusts all have a little bit different mission and focus of what they're trying to achieve. And they run the gamut from the Nature Conservancy, which of course is an international organization, and in Montana, they own large preserves and also focus on conservation only in about 3 areas, like the Rocky Mountain Front and the Centennial Valley. Then there's the Montana Land Reliance, which is my organization, the only organization that actually works statewide. And we are now the largest state-based open space and agricultural land trust in the nation. Then there are regional and local land trusts, such as the Gallatin Valley Land Trust, which works primarily in Gallatin County and Park County, the Flathead Land Trust that works up in the Flathead region, Prickly Pear Land Trust that works in Lewis and Clark County. And finally, there are a couple of land trusts that focus on habitat, wildlife habitat, such as the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, whose goal is to preserve elk habitat, and the Vital Ground Foundation focused on protecting grizzly bear habitat. So everybody's got a little bit different mission and focus, but the end goal is that we're all preserving private lands that benefit all of us and benefit the future. Some of these local land trusts also have trails programs, which is something Montana Land Reliance as a statewide organization does not have. And then to just give you a little bit of information about the Montana Land Reliance, lands, forest resources, fish and wildlife habitat, and open space. As I mentioned, we're the only land trust that works statewide, and we only hold conservation easements. So we don't have a trails program. We don't own property outright like the Nature Conservancy does. And the information I'm going to give you today is really primarily focused on the work of the Montana Land Reliance and the data that's attributable to Montana only for the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, but you can find out more about what's going on in Idaho and Wyoming by looking up on the web the Teton Regional Land Trust in Idaho and the Jackson Hole Land Trust and Wyoming Stock Growers Land Trust in Wyoming. And those organizations are also working in their respective states in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So here's a little bit of history and accomplishments of what easements have done in Montana. So we have only had the ability to have conservation easements in Montana since 1976. And that's when the first conservation easement was put in place up in the Blackfoot area by the Nature Conservancy, which at that time didn't even have an office west of the Mississippi. So we've come a long way in that short time frame. We're not even quite 50 years yet. And so Montana Land Reliance has been in organization and been working since 1978. And we are now, Montana as a whole is considered a national leader in the number of easements and the amount of acreage of private lands that are protected. So at present, there are about 2.6 million acres of private land across Montana that are protected with conservation easements. Montana Land Reliance holds about 1,232,000 of those acres, with maybe as much as another 70,000 to be added this year by the time the end of the year is done, all across Montana. And that's comprised of 945 separate conservation easements that we manage each year. So of that total, 328,000 acres in Montana itself are located in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and are held by Montana Land Reliance. And just for a couple of other stats for fun and giggles, about 143,000 of those are adjacent to public lands, and 139,000 of that total is elk habitat. So there is quite a lot that's protected here already, but there's certainly more opportunity. And we are all seeing the incredible development pressure that's happening here. And protecting, private lands is so important, and more important than it's ever been, because the development pressure and the explosion of people coming here is putting intense pressure not only on the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, but other parts of Montana and other western states. We are fast losing all of those qualities of life and our environment that are bringing everybody here. And Bozeman itself is the fastest growing community of its size in Montana and in the nation. So it's a race against time in a lot of ways. Part of what's going on in the state is that Gallatin County is kind of ground zero for all of the development pressure that's happening in Montana, and that's just kind of radiating out from the core to Park County, Madison County, etc. And if you drive around, you will see houses and subdivisions and things popping up all over the place, and that's taking away from that open land and that wildlife habitat, good agricultural land that we all need. So super important that we do as much as we can while we can, and while there is still opportunity to protect important lands in Montana and the other states. So here is, hopefully you can see this on your screen. This is an overall map of Montana that represents those 2.6 million acres of private lands protected across the state, and they are showing up in the blue color and the magenta color. And you can see that there is quite a lot of conservation in western Montana. Most of the easements are in western Montana at present, but central and eastern Montana are certainly adding acreage all the time, because there's development pressure there, and there's also now programs that can help provide financial incentives for folks to help protect land too. Most particularly sage grouse habitat, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And as you can see, even though there's 2.6 million private land acres protected, there's still a lot of opportunity out there. So next for you, this is, I'll just throw in a few nice pictures for people to enjoy as we go through this. This is a view of a piece of property that's up in the Bridger Mountains that has a Montana Land Reliance easement, and it is surrounded on all four sides by Forest Service land. So it's a section that otherwise could have been developed, but now never will be. And it is just adding to that conservation that's already there with the public land surrounding it. Quite a beautiful place. So it's really important to understand what a conservation easement is and how it works as kind of a basis to all the work that's being done in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So what is a conservation easement? Well, it's essentially a voluntary legal agreement between a landowner and a land trust that protects the property in perpetuity and limits the uses of the land in order to protect its conservation values. But the land remains in private ownership. And so this agreement, when it's recorded and put in place, it is created in perpetuity. So whomever owns that piece of property in the future, whether it be an heir, whether it be a third-party buyer, etc., they are obligated to abide by the terms of that conservation easement that was put in place by the original landowner, whether it's 5 years from now or 500 years from now. And each conservation easement is really tailored to the unique character of that property, the conservation values of the land itself, and to the vision, the goals, the needs of the landowner and their family, if there is a family involved. So there's no cookie cutter about these. They are unique as to each property. And the most important thing, perhaps, is that a conservation easement is the only tool and the only permanent way that we have presently to protect land forever. You know, you can have covenants or deed restrictions, zoning regulations, and all of that sort of thing, but all of those can be amended, changed, overturned, disregarded, etc., but not a conservation easement, at least not yet. Of course, we're a long way from perpetuity and forever because we only started on this path in 1976, but there has not been a conservation easement overturned in Montana so far, and we hope that that will never happen. And a conservation easement, when we think of an easement, we may think of an easement like for a road or a power line, etc., where you're allowing someone else to use a portion of your property for specific purposes. A conservation easement is a right to prohibit certain uses. So the landowner is granting to the land trust those use rights, essentially, as part of the bundle of rights of ownership that are never to be exercised on the land or to be limited. So your typical road or power line easement is called an affirmative easement, and a conservation easement is a negative easement. Sometimes it might make more sense if we called conservation easements conservation agreements or conservation contracts. That might make more sense, but that's not the way the title developed. So in order to place a conservation easement on a property, there are certain legal requirements. First of all, if a landowner wants to obtain any kind of funding or receive any kind of income tax benefits, the conservation easement has to be created in perpetuity. While it is legally possible to create an easement for a certain term of years, I don't know of any land trust that would do that because you're only just postponing inevitable development. The federal government, through some of its programs, does have easement terms for a certain number of years for wetland easements and things like that. but that's a bit of a different animal than a permanent conservation easement. The easement also has to be able to provide certain conservation easements. You've got to be able to protect relatively natural wildlife, fish or plant habitat, preserve open space, which includes agricultural and forest lands, preserve land for the purpose of education or public recreation, and you can also preserve historically important structures or areas, like Lewis and Clark had a trail through this property, that sort of thing. Most properties have more than one of these purposes to the easement. The easement has to be granted to a qualified entity, and in Montana, that's either a private land trust, like the Montana Land Reliance, and all of the land trusts are 501c3 nonprofit organizations, or a government agency, like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or Fish, Wildlife and Parks, that sort of thing. The easement has to prohibit certain degrading activities like surface mining, unlimited subdivision, toxic waste dumping, and then you've got to document what the condition of the property is at the time the easement is put in place. Here is a map that shows a kind of a close-up view of the Gallatin Valley, and we're there about in the middle in Bozeman, and you can see that right in the core of the valley there is quite a lot of conservation that's been done, and you can look at the blue, purple, and the pink areas. Those are conservation easements that currently exist, but the map doesn't actually reflect easements that are in process right now. And there are at least several thousand more acres in process of conservation easements in Gallatin County, primarily between the work of the Montana Land Reliance and the work of the Gallatin Valley Land Trust. So that map is getting filled in more and more all the time. And you might notice the large pink area down at the bottom left of the map. That is Ted Turner's Flying D Ranch. That's part of it only, which he protected that land with the Nature Conservancy back in the late 1980s. One of the most important conservation easements that exists. It's almost like its own national park. So it's important to understand, why do private landowners grant conservation easements? Why do they want to do this? And remember, it's voluntary, so people make this choice. The fundamental reason why people choose to protect their land is because they care about it. They love it. It means something to them in their heart and soul, or to their family. And they feel that it's most important to be protected and never be developed into a housing subdivision or some commercial uses, etc. There are other reasons too. Obviously, to prevent undesired uses. This is where you're preventing having a housing subdivision or a car dealership in your hayfield. People use conservation easements for family legacy, to keep the farm in the family or the ranch in the family, and for estate planning. They also grant easements because they're seeking to offset income tax liability, and or they also need cash compensation. They need funding to help them continue, either pay off debt, pay, estate planning purposes, buy additional land, all kinds of reasons and ways that people use the funds that they receive on those easements that have a cash component. They can use those monies for all sorts of different reasons. People use easements to protect family unity and keep the land intact, where you have a number of heirs or a number of children who might inherit, some who would want to sell the property or see it subdivided, some who want to leave the land intact. A conservation easement is a way for the parents to make the choice about how they want to see that farm or ranch continue. And so a conservation easement basically stops the squabbling over what's to happen with the ranch later. And of course, the program is voluntary, so folks choose to do this, and it's private. So all of these transactions where conservation easements are put in place, they are private unless the landowner wants to choose to have some public announcement or, press release made, etc. Here's a map that shows the protected areas in the Paradise Valley right now, again, between Montana Land Reliance and primarily the Nature Conservancy and Gallatin Valley Land Trust. You can see that the Paradise Valley is a much more narrow valley than the Gallatin Valley, and so there's been a great deal done, and much of those lands that are protected are up against public lands. But again, there's more opportunity, and in fact, Montana Land Reliance and Gallatin Valley Land Trust are working together in this area trying to increase conservation because there's tremendous development pressure there now in the Paradise Valley, which is pushing development, and people are rightly concerned about what's happening there.
Say, could I interrupt just a second?
Yes.
Paige, are the folks online seeing the screen as well?
Yep.
Oh, they are. Good.
Okay, I guess what we're seeing is just the top of it, but they can see the whole thing?
Yep.
Good, okay. So one of the great things is that we have the support, both organizations have the support of the AMB West Foundation. This is Arthur Blank's foundation, the founder of the Home Depot, who is very, very involved in the Paradise Valley and owns properties there that have been protected with conservation easements through Montana Land Reliance. And they have made grants to both organizations to help increase education and outreach and to help cover some of the costs of putting easements in place for landowners who aren't able to do that themselves. So this is a great support for both our organizations to try to make a real push for more protection in the Paradise Valley. Oop, we went up instead of down. Here we go. So just a brief little bit about the financial considerations that are connected with conservation easements. So they are either income tax benefits or cash funding. So back in 2015, after many years of being temporary, the enhanced tax benefits for donating conservation easements were made permanent. And what this means is that the monetary value of a conservation easement, which is determined by a specialized appraisal, when donated to the land trust, which is a private not-for-profit 501c3 organization, much like the food bank or the Humane Society, you can write off the value of that easement as a charitable donation over a lengthy period of time off of your income taxes, off of your adjusted gross income each year, either at the 50% or the 100% level. And what I mean by that is that you pay income tax on what is your adjusted gross income. This is after you've had your deductions and so on off your gross income. And the amount of the easement can write off or take off the top of that adjusted gross income, either 50% of it, if you are considered, I guess, a regular landowner where the majority of your income is coming from sources like wages, investment income, leases, Social Security, those pensions, that sort of thing. You can write off 50% of that adjusted gross income and then pay income taxes only on the remaining 50% for a period up to 16 years until you use up the total of the donation value. So that which isn't used in the first year carries over to the second and so on. If you're considered a qualified farmer or rancher, and the majority of your gross income in the year the easement is put in place comes from farming and ranching activities of a broad range, you can write off 100% of your adjusted gross income over that same time period and carry forward that which isn't used. So it's a very useful tool to help people keep more money in their pocket. At the same time, for certain transactions, there are funding programs that landowners can make use of, either through the federal government. The primary one that we have through the federal government is the Natural Resources Conservation Services Agricultural Land Easement Program, or ALE, A-L-E, which is focused on compensating landowners who have lands that either possess a high percentage of prime and important soils, according to their qualifications, or are natural grasslands that haven't been sod busted and won't be, that remain as grasslands, and most all of those also possess wildlife that are species of concern, like golden eagles, etc. Wildlife, plants, fish, etc., that are considered species of concern, or endangered species. Both of those qualify. So there are properties that have those attributes and that the landowner may be able to apply and seek funding through those programs. There are 4 counties in Montana, Gallatin County being one of them, that have open space programs where taxpayers, either through mill levies or open space bonds, cover the cost of helping compensate landowners for conservation easements in those counties. Again, an application process, certain criteria, etc. Only 4 counties in Montana. Thankfully, we have that in Gallatin County, which has been extremely helpful and helped protect more than 50,000 acres in the last 22 years. The other counties are Lewis and Clark County, Ravalli, and Missoula County. There's also really the state program that's been in use for the last few years is the program that is focused on compensating landowners who have lands in core sage grouse habitat. And this was part of the state's overall program to help protect sage grouse habitat so that sage grouse wouldn't get listed as an endangered species by the federal government. And that program has provided funding for landowners mostly in central and eastern Montana, where the vast majority of core habitat is, and has proven to be extremely beneficial as well. There's also sometimes foundation funds, and sometimes there are funds that private individuals have donated to land trusts for the specific purpose of protecting lands that possess certain characteristics or are in certain areas that that donor has an interest in protecting. That's a much more rare situation, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. As time has gone on, there are less and less easements that are purely donated. More and more folks who want to protect their land need some kind of cash component. It's really not possible in Montana really not possible in Montana to actually receive cash compensation for the full value of an easement. But depending on the circumstances, you might be able to get as much as 75% protected, which is pretty good. And then the rest is donated and can help offset capital gains tax and or income taxes in the future. Just a quick review of how is easement value determined? Well, there has to be an appraisal. It's a very specialized appraisal done by a qualified conservation easement appraiser, of which there are actually very few in Montana, and we could certainly use more. And essentially what they are doing is determining what is the value of this piece of property currently, its market value, with all of its rights intact. The right to subdivide it, the right to build houses on it, put commercial structures, put a mine on it, whatever, all of the rights that it currently possesses. What is it worth now? And then what is the property worth after a conservation easement is put in place that limits or prohibits certain uses of the property? And the difference between those two, because generally there is a diminution or a reduction in value of the property after certain use rights are stripped off, that is the value of the conservation easement. And I've just given you a very simple example here on the screen. And there is no, each property is different. The real estate market is different in different areas. What something was worth in 2018 is different in 2022. So the value is kind of a moving target depending on when you're putting an easement in place and what the market conditions are, comparable sales, et cetera. So when folks who work for land trusts are going out and talking to landowners, there's no way to really say, Rancher Smith, we think your easement's going to be worth X, or you'll have X% diminution in value. It's different for every property and every time. Sometimes there isn't even a diminution in value, depending on what's going on in the real estate market and comparable sales. And other times you might see a 50% reduction in value. It also has a lot to do with what the terms of the easement are and how restrictive it is. So it's on the value of the easement that funding is determined and donation value is determined. Okay. Sorry, going backwards here. So here's the basic structure of an easement. Within a broad framework of what constitutes a valid easement under federal and state law, there are the two really important component parts of an easement. Those rights that are retained, these are all the rights that you can continue to use and do with the property. And then there are restricted rights. These are the rights or uses that are either prohibited or restricted in some way that are granted to the land trust, who in a practical sense is taking those rights and locking them up in a vault forever, so they can never be exercised on that property. Okay. Here is, this is a beautiful map, I have to say. So this is the core of the Madison Valley that shows all of the conservation easements that are there now, with Ennis up kind of in the middle. And we call this the poster child for private land conservation in Montana.
Wow.
Because about 70% of all the private land in the Madison Valley has been protected with conservation easements, most of it through Montana Land Reliance, but some through the Nature Conservancy and Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation as the other primary land trusts that have worked there. And we're not done yet. So there's still more conservation going on in the Madison Valley. And so when people drive over there in that area and they see the wide open spaces there, it's because of conservation easements.
And that area on the right that's largely private, that must be Moonlight Basin?
What's on the right, where you see the 64 on the number, that whole area, that is Big Sky. And there's actually now more conservation easements that have been done in Big Sky than what shows on this map. And surprisingly, there's still more that can be done. So, and boy, that is critically important for habitat and biodiversity up here in these mountains and these areas where these lands abut with the public lands.
And the yellow is BLM or
The
something?
yellow is BLM lands and the green is all Forest Service, in this case, Forest Service lands. And the light blue are state of Montana trust lands. I keep going the wrong way with this thing. All right, so this is going to be the last part of the sort of basic information of an easement. So this next slide shows sort of the typical sorts of uses that are retained under an easement. So you can still continue to use the property agriculturally for all manner of agricultural uses, for timber management. You can still construct buildings, fences, make improvements to water resources. You can allow for additional residences that are compatible with conservation objectives. You can lease the property. You can allow for guest ranching. You can have a bed and breakfast. You can have residence-based businesses that are not retail sales and service. And you can have agriculturally based commercial uses that don't do any damage to the conservation values of the property. A perfect example is an easement I'm working on now where it's a lovely farm that they have in the fall a corn maze for about 6 weeks. They have several acres planted in corn and they create a maze through that corn, charge people a small fee to come out and have fun, kids play. It's helping their family farm continue to be successful in difficult economic times for farmers and ranchers. Once the maize is done, that corn gets harvested and actually goes and is used by a dairy locally, and everything is folded up till the next season. That's a really good example of an agricultural commercial activity that isn't damaging in any way to your resources on the property or to the conservation values, and as opposed to, say, a commercial feedlot, which is a prohibited use. You can also allow for all kinds of restoration of habitats, of streams, of historic structures, and the landowner retains control of the access to the property and management. So under conservation easements, many times people feel that there is a requirement that people have to grant public access. And that's not actually correct unless the landowner has chosen to grant public access and or has participated in a funding program that might require public access as a condition of funding. So the control of access for hunting, fishing, whatever, is retained by the landowner. And it would be nearly impossible for a land trust to be able to enforce any kind of no fishing or no hunting provision in an easement, because you pretty much have to post a guard there all the time, 24/7, which isn't possible. So one of the things we always have to think about when we're crafting easements is that the provisions or the restrictions, they have to be enforceable by the land trust. Long ago, I think there was an easement created where the landowner absolutely didn't want cats on the property because they killed birds. How do you enforce that? It's really not possible, but sometimes we're asked to do things that you cannot enforce, and you have to politely say no and try to find another way around it. So lots of continued uses. And then here are the uses that are typically restricted or prohibited. So a limitation or prohibition on subdividing the property and on non-agricultural commercial uses. And what I mean by that is You don't allow for any commercial feedlot, RV parks, restaurants, car dealerships, strip malls, all those sorts of things that land gets developed into are prohibited under conservation easements. You are limiting any residential construction and where it's located. So under conservation easements, any kind of new construction, whether it be residential or agricultural or recreational, has to be determined ahead of time how many can be allowed, including what's already there, and specifically where it can be located within very carefully laid out and designed building envelopes. So that in the future, it's very clearly stated where somebody can build or rebuild a structure or structures, so that there's no ability for anyone to put structures just willy-nilly anywhere on the property. There's a prohibition of surface mining, of dumping toxic or hazardous wastes, no billboards, limitation on, basically limiting structures all the way around, limiting and restricting road development, utilities development, restricting major utility corridor right-of-ways for big power line structures, although conservation easements sadly cannot protect against the exercise of eminent domain. However, having land protected under an easement does make it much harder for the power company or the Department of Transportation to exercise their right of eminent domain if they're choosing to put a new power line or expand a road or something like that. They really have to deal with that property much more carefully than they would otherwise on an unprotected property. There's also prohibition of large-scale wind farms, cell towers, big indoor riding arenas, those kinds of things. So you're really restricting all those sort of undesirable uses that ultimately destroy open space, wildlife habitat, agricultural lands, etc. Okay. Then, and lastly, basically, is what are the rights that are granted to the land trust, who is the party that has to be the steward of this conservation easement forever. So the landowner is granting to the land trust the right to preserve and protect the property according to the terms of the easement forever, the right to enter the property with proper notice and to visit the property at least once a year to ensure compliance with the terms of the easement. So we have land stewards whose job it is to pay a visit to that property every year, visit with the landowner where it's possible, take a look at the property, talk with the landowner about what's going on, and ensure that a structure hasn't been built somewhere where it isn't supposed to be, a road built, something done with that property that is adverse to the terms of the easement. And if that has happened, then the land trust has the right to enjoin, to stop that from happening, and to restore the property back to its original condition if necessary, to make sure that that easement agreement is adhered to. Fortunately, so far, I can say that Montana Land Reliance has yet to have to actually go to court to get an injunction to stop someone from, building a high-rise in their cornfield or something egregious like that. It's come close, but we haven't had to do that. Most, I guess what you'd call violations of the terms of the easement are minor, based on a misunderstanding or lack of understanding of the terms of the easement, and can be easily resolved. The idea is that once you have an easement in place, the landowner, whomever they are, and the land trust are in partnership forever. In fact, we call our easement landowners MLR's family of friends. It's almost like a family because Montana Land Reliance or any land trust has to be closely connected with that landowner to ensure that continued protection of that land and be the steward of that easement forever, for however long forever is. Here's a lovely picture of some property in the lower Paradise Valley that's adjacent to Forest Service lands and just a few miles to the north of Yellowstone Park. Now, down to the crux of everything, which I know we're running out of time. So now that we get beyond the basics of easements, what are we doing? What are we doing as land trust to help protect more land, private lands in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem? So while I can't speak for everything that all land trusts might be doing, I can speak to what MLR has been doing and the tools that we have available to help increase conservation in our ecosystem. So one of the big things that we do is we focus on building neighborhood conservation. And this map is a good example of it. There are now, after 40 some years of work being done across Montana, there are areas and specific geographic areas where there's been a lot of conservation done. Perfect example, the Madison Valley. But there are still holes or lands that are adjacent or within areas where those lands aren't protected. And so we're trying to focus on building neighborhood conservation and filling in those holes where it's possible. We seek to protect more lands that are contingent or are close to public lands. You know, I would say this, that, you know, the animals don't make a distinction between public and private lands. They don't know the difference. So they're going to go, travel, migrate where they always have, if it's possible, if that corridor where they migrate or where they winter or they calve or something like that is still available to them. So when we can protect more lands that are connected to public lands, it's a big win for conservation. And we're using data and mapping tools to help us locate where wildlife corridors are, where habitats are. This map here is a part of the southern Madison Valley. I have a colleague on my staff who is a wildlife biologist, but he's also a mapping expert. And he's been able to use all of the data that's available to create this map as an example, which shows you in the red on the color scale, the red, that area is where there's a major wildlife corridor. And the color gradient, as you can see, from red down to green is from high to low. So we at the Land Reliance, who are project managers, we can look at that and say, oh my goodness, there's this unprotected piece of property that's right has this big wildlife corridor right in it. Let's try to see if this landowner would be willing to protect that land. That's always the challenge, because conservation easements are voluntary. The landowner has to be making that choice willingly to protect their land. Sometimes it happens very quickly. Other times it might take years before the stars align for the landowner to be in a position to be ready to protect their land. Sometimes we have to wait for the next generation to own the property, or for some funding opportunity, or all kinds of reasons. But at MLR, we've had projects that have taken up to 20 years to come to fruition, but finally did. And then there are ones that take just a very few months and everything in between. So again, it's the voluntary nature that means we can't always protect what we might think is the most logical property to do so, or what might make the most sense, but we have these tools to help us focus on what makes sense. So we also have data that helps us understand not only wildlife corridors, but biodiversity, species of concern, important water resources, all kinds of things that can help us focus our work in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem as well as across Montana to increase conservation where it makes sense. So that's one tool. And then this is another example of some mapping. So this is an example of a map using tools that we have to show for grizzly bear paths, where they're dispersing. This happens to be a section of the Ruby Valley with twin bridges right in the middle, and we're looking at grizzly bear movements. The dark blue is the least randomized, and the lighter blue is more randomized. And you can see almost this path that goes right through twin bridges for grizzly bears. The red areas on the map are private lands where landowners have expressed an interest to protect their lands. So we can look at that and say, oh my goodness, here is this private land that's right in this important grizzly bear path. So that's a tool we have along with the other wildlife corridors. We use the Montana Natural Heritage Program data. And in the last, year to year and a half, we have been able to make use of your own Professor Andy Hansen's program that he's developed to help determine biodiversity, the level of biodiversity on particular lands. This has become increasingly important here and has been a really powerful tool to help verify biodiversity, given that in the last year, Montana Land Reliance received an incredibly generous planned gift from a gentleman who was a true believer in conservation easements. And he made a planned gift of nearly the entirety of his estate. Sadly, he passed away last year, but it has meant that several $1 million have come to Montana Land Reliance from this private donor's estate that we are able to use to help purchase conservation easements on lands that possess high biodiversity within western Montana. Those are the two primary criteria for this gift. And I can say that this is a tremendous gift to the future of Montana and leaves quite a legacy. Right now, we've got about eight projects that are making use of this gift partially, and there will be more as time goes on. And they're protecting lands that otherwise might not have had any other way to be protected because they're providing funding for landowners who need and want some amount of cash compensation where they either could not otherwise qualify for any of the available funding programs, not in the right county, maybe don't have the right percentage of prime soils, things like that. They wouldn't have been protected otherwise. And they are extremely important properties to help ensure continued biodiversity on private lands. So these are all of the tools that we have now: funding, tax benefits, the data, the mapping capabilities that we have that we as land trust can make use of to help us focus on protecting the best land we possibly can. Not only, agricultural lands, but wildlife habitat, clean water, all of this biodiversity that's so important to protect. Here's just another couple of photos of some protected lands that this one's in the Paradise Valley looking at the Absaroka Mountains. And this is a stream on that beautiful place up in the Bridgers that we first looked at, that's surrounded by public land. That's our most precious resource, water, I think, more than anything else. So I want to share with you some resources to learn more. So to learn more about the work of private land conservation and land trust, you can check out Montana Land Reliance's website, Montana Association of Land Trust website, which will connect you to all the other land trusts in Montana, and then the Land Trust Alliance, which is the nationwide organization that land trusts across the country belong to. And they are also the agency that does accreditation for land trust, does advocacy and policy and education across the country. And through them, you can find land trusts in your area, whether it be West Virginia, Washington, Texas, etc. So that's a very good, helpful resource too. So I want to thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak with you. You know, all of us land trusts are working to help keep Montana the last best place, and to put that forever benefit on those private lands that are so important to protect, that, you know, ensure that nature continues to exist, that future generations of people can still enjoy open space and scenic view and have locally produced food and enjoy wildlife and clean water and all those things that are so absolutely vital to protect and that they're not making any more of. So I am happy to answer questions here at the end. And I have, for those of you who are here, I did bring some brochures. If anyone who's visited online here today is interested in some informational brochures, you could let Paige know, and I can certainly email brochures to you. May I answer questions?
Well, let's thank Kathryn.
Thank you.
I think we probably ought to formally break. There weren't any questions online, or?
No, not that I saw.
Yeah, so why don't we, just, for questions you all might have, we can just do that one-on-one
Yeah.
and let folks go online.
Thank you, folks online.
So Kathryn, what a pleasure to hear what you're doing. In this period of gloom and doom, you're doing the real deal. It's just so uplifting to see what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel very blessed that I'm able to do this work. I've been involved with the Reliance for, my goodness, 35 plus years now, but it's only been in the last about 8.5 that I was able to formally be on the team. And so in what I call the third chapter of my life, I have the opportunity to do something that will, in the end, leave the world better than I found it and leave a lasting benefit. And, you know, I'm a bit of a pessimist about where we're going in the world. You know, it's hard to know if we're going to have a world much longer at the rate we're going. But, you know, when you put an easement on a piece of property, you're hedging your bets that there will be a world, still a Montana. And, you know, we have to keep trying, because if we don't, and we don't protect land, it won't be there. It'll be gone. But if we do protect it, we are helping to ensure that there is a future for all of us, people and nature.
Good, thank you so much.
Sure.
So let's just go one-on-one at this point, or as we
Questions?
like
I
to.
will do my best to answer. Or
You said one-on-one.
Thoughts?
Can we just
Just-
talk now?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I'm curious about the difference of use of land easements, conservation easements in urban proximal versus rural areas where feel like the development pressures in Bozeman specifically that are pushing development outward, which I feel like Todd Wilkinson will talk about.
Yes.
That's a different sort of pressure on folks that if someone were trying to exercise eminent domain or use the land for subdivisions, there's more pressure around Bozeman specifically than like way out away from major population centers. How does that change how easements are set up? And
Well, so the Bozeman area is a good example. You know, Bozeman is just growing out so fast. And of course, the majority of the development is growing into areas that are, just from an agricultural standpoint, the richest agricultural soils in the state, if not the nation, here. And of course, when Bozeman was originally founded in 1864, John Bozeman and his folks, where did they settle? Well, they settled in the spot where they had the richest agricultural soil and water, because they had to grow food for themselves and others. So I can't imagine what John Bozeman would be thinking now if he could see what has become of Bozeman, because it, of course, started there at the core, right about Main and Rouse, by Bozeman Creek, which is under the concrete. And it's radiated out from there. And much of the growth has gone out toward the northwest, and out, 19th and out toward the river. And that is where there's feet deep topsoil that has been, for many, many years, absolutely fantastically productive ag soils. But there's very little. There's only a few farms of any size still left in what we call the triangle, which is the area bordered by Bozeman, Belgrade, Four Corners, kind of the river, I-90, and Huffine and Jackrabbit. And so much of that land has been developed or is being developed that there's really little opportunity now to protect much of it with a conservation easement, because it's very, very hard to continue an agricultural operation when you've got subdivision on all four sides of you and you can't move your equipment. People are complaining about your ag operation, manure smells, things like that. And so sadly, most folks who have been there have sold, taken the money and gone, to eastern Montana or central Montana and bought something 3 times bigger than what they had, because their dollars are going a lot farther there. That being the case, there are some lands that are protected in the core or right around Bozeman and other places, that those conservation easements will still continue to exist. They're still stewarded. They're going to be there. We also have the situation where organizations like the Trust for Public Land, which you may all be familiar with, one of the land trusts that operates in Montana, that they have worked very hard to acquire lands that could then come into the public domain, like the Story Mill project, which otherwise would be land that would be all developed. And that land has become parks, open space. Some of it's becoming housing, some of which is more affordable, all sorts of things. And the Story Mill Park area is owned by the city of Bozeman now. So there's those opportunities. I'm actually working on a project a little bit different than what MLR usually does with Sacagawea Audubon Society. They have acquired through a gift and through purchase land right at the eastern edge of Bozeman off of North Broadway in the village downtown development that looks like the colonial buildings you may have seen, bounded by I-90. It's a big, big wetland. They've acquired that and it's being turned into a permanent restored wetland property and a preserve. And Montana Land Reliance is putting the conservation easement on that property so that it will always be protected as a wetland, as open space, as wildlife habitat, as a filter for the water that's running through there that ultimately gets into the East Gallatin. East Gallatin is impaired, and so it needs all the help it can get. And so this will help do that. So that's in process. And there are some opportunities on some smaller parcels where lands can be protected under something that's maybe slightly less than a conservation easement, but has much the same effect, called the conservation servitude. And it has essentially all the same attributes of a conservation easement, but you can't get a tax deduction. And the option to enforce it is, the enforcement provision is a little bit less than mandatory. So there can be an option to enforce or not. And those kinds of instruments can be held by organizations other than land trusts. So I've been working on this for some time, and we have, as a couple of our local organizations, been talking about the idea of developing a program where landowners with smaller parcels that would be well suited for things like parks or truck farming, small agricultural or just open space, recreational uses that could remain in private hands, could have a servitude placed on them that would give them much the same protections as a conservation easement, where a conservation easement isn't really an appropriate tool. That's going to take a while because it's complicated, but it is something that's in process.
So one question I would
I'm
have.
not sure, I hope I answered your
You did,
question,
yeah.
but, okay. Thank you, Diane. Good to see you. Yes,
So the IOE represents, various departments on campus,
yes.
from political science to natural science, et cetera, economics. And we have the foundation that's working with philanthropists. I wonder if there are types of information that the university could be providing that would be helpful to land trusts like yours, that would make a big difference. That whether we could develop a package to try to get philanthropic support to develop information that would support the conservation easement efforts along with other types of conservation implementations. Are there types of information that you would benefit from that the university could generate?
Well, I think you're already doing that with that report that you do, your biodiversity report, which is very helpful to us. I may not be the best person to answer this question because I'm not the mapping expert and the data expert like my colleague in Helena is. And I think he has access to a vast array of information that I'm not even sure what he has, but I can usually ask him and say, can you figure this, X out? And if he can't, he can tell me, and if he can do it. But I think it's very, very important and would be very useful for MSU and Land Trust to work together to have that conversation about what can the university, specifically this, the Institute on Ecosystems, what tools do you have, what information do you have that can help Land Trust do their job more effectively, have better tools, and maybe how can we better help you? I know from my own work, one of the best ways I've been able to help the university is to have discussions, make a presentation. I'm made one last year with Dr. Pritchard's group. And Diane Dubinsky's been involved with some of my work, and you've been a tremendous benefit and help with your biodiversity work and so on. And I'd love to connect, it would be great to maybe have some gathering or some meeting together where folks could share. You could share with the experts in my organization the tools you have and vice versa, where as a person out in the field, I don't have quite all of the understanding of all the technical tools that we have to use. I apologize for that. I'm better at the real estate end of this than I am at the electronic data end of it. As you could tell by, can't even get the PowerPoint to work right. So, but I'd love to do that. Part of it is we've all been so busy, which is a blessing. We have all been so busy, we can barely catch our breath with the amount of demand there is for easements, which is great. That's what you want. The time is of the essence, I think, here for all of us.
Daniel,
Sir.
you have a thought or question?
My only question was, it seems that conservation easements are one of the main tools. Sorry, for conservation on private lands. I was wondering what are some of the main challenges. It sounds like one of the main challenges might just be staffing at this point and getting the conservation easements put together in time.
The main, not so much staffing. I think the main challenges for private land conservation in Montana, and I can't speak to other areas, but I can speak to Montana and to our area, is the availability of enough funding for the demand that's out there. That demand is ever increasing. The programs that are available have limited funds every year to use for conservation easements. They're competitive. There's generally more applications for funding than there's funds available in any given year. There are areas where there isn't any funding available. Many counties, many places in Montana don't have funding. So increase in funding is an important, an ever increasing need for funding for conservation easements. A need to continue to do the education and outreach that's necessary to reach people so that they understand how conservation easements actually work. There is a lot of myth and misunderstanding out in the world about what conservation easements are, how they work, and what land trusts are. Especially in the more rural areas, there is a lot of misunderstanding and misconception that land trusts are government agencies, and a conservation easement is the government controlling you. Neither of which are true. The government of any kind isn't really involved in this at all, except for the income tax benefits you can choose to take part in, or if you're choosing to participate in a funding program that's connected with a government agency. Otherwise, you're dealing with a private, not-for-profit land trust. No government agency at all. Other myths that are out there include that you lose control of your land, that you can't hunt and fish on it anymore, that you don't own your land anymore. All kinds of things like that, which are not true, not correct. But when folks believe those things and think that that's the way it works, it's no wonder they don't want to protect their land with an easement, because it sounds horrible, but it's not true. So getting the correct information out to people and building trust, which is so important, takes time, takes effort, and takes folks willing to listen and to understand the truth so that they can actually make a really informed decision for themselves. And I think the other thing is just the nature of easements in that they are voluntary. And today, an easement on a piece of land might not be right for that landowner, but maybe next year or 5 years from now, it might be right, where the circumstances have come together to make an easement make sense for that landowner or their family, or funding has become available, all kinds of reasons why an easement might make sense